On September 26, 1855, a skinny 16-year-old boy walked through the streets of Cleveland like his life depended on it. Because it did. He had been searching for weeks, door after door, office after office, repeating the same sentence until it felt like prayer. I'm looking for work. Most men didn't even look up from their desks. Some gave him the smile adults reserve for children with impossible ambitions. He was nobody. No connections, no college, no family name that opened doors. But that morning, a commission merchant finally said yes. 50 cents a day. To most people, that would be a footnote. A small job in a growing city. A teenager earning pocket money before the real life began. To John D. Rockefeller, it was the real life beginning. He would remember the date for the rest of his life. Not his birthday. Not the day he became rich. Not the day his company swallowed a rival. This day. He called it Job Day. And every year, long after he became one of the richest human beings ever to live, he paused on September 26th as if it were a holy anniversary. Because in his mind, this was the day the world revealed its rules, and John Rockefeller loved rules. He had grown up in a household where the rules were often the only thing holding the roof up. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, moved through life like a storm. He called himself a doctor, though he had no medical training, and travelled the countryside selling miracle cures to desperate people. He could charm a room. He could vanish for months. He could return with money or return with nothing, leaving his wife and children staring at the same empty pantry, trying not to show fear. People around them had a nickname for him, Devil Bill, and in small towns, nicknames are not jokes. They are verdicts. At home, Devil Bill could be generous, flash a roll of cash, tell stories, laugh loudly, play the hero. But he was also a man of secrets and double lives, a man who made promises the way gamblers place bets, emotionally, impulsively, and often without intention to pay. Rockefeller's mother was the opposite. Eliza Rockefeller ran the house like a disciplined ledger. Her faith was not performance, it was structure. She believed in hard work, thrift, and one commandment above all others: never waste. Not time, not food, not money, not effort. Waste was sin wearing ordinary clothes, and she taught her children something very specific: 10%. Whatever you earn, you give 10% to God. Not when you feel generous, not when you're comfortable, not when you're proud. First, John absorbed this rule like ink into paper, and he absorbed another rule too, one he never said out loud as a child but would live by as a man. If life is unstable, you become stability. In 1853, the family moved near Cleveland, Ohio, a city rising fast on the energy of railroads, lake trade, and industry. Cleveland smelled like coal smoke, wet wood, and ambition. It was not elegant. It was not old money. It was a place where a person could arrive with nothing and leave with everything, if they understood the system. John didn't go to college. Instead, he took a brief course in bookkeeping and went looking for work with the stubborn seriousness of someone who believed numbers could save him. That's what he did at the commission merchant's office, numbers. He recorded shipments. He tracked payments. He wrote transactions into ledgers with neat precision. He checked every calculation twice. Not because he was anxious, because he was building a habit. He wasn't just working, he was training. From his first paycheck, he tithed 10%. He wrote it down carefully, like an expense, not a gift. Charity wasn't a mood, it was a line in the ledger, obligation, discipline, proof that money didn't own him. Then he did the other thing. He saved. Rockefeller lived like a man who expected the floor to drop out from under him. He walked instead of paying for transport. He brought lunch instead of buying it. He wore clothes until they were exhausted. Every spare cent went into savings and then, quietly without fanfare, into interest. At the end of his first year, he had saved enough to lend a small amount to a neighbouring farmer. The farmer paid him back with interest. Rockefeller recorded the payment, reinvested it, and watched a simple truth take shape. Money could reproduce, not by magic, not by risk, not by wild dreams, by method. This is the part of the Rockefeller story people miss when they jump straight to oil and monopoly and octopus cartoons. Before the empire, there was a personality, a boy who believed life was a ledger and God was an auditor. His employers noticed. They promoted him. His salary increased. His habits didn't change. He treated every raise as a test of character. Can I receive more without becoming someone else? By 19, he had saved enough to form a partnership with a friend named Morris Clark. Together they started a commission business dealing in grain, hay, meat, whatever moved through Cleveland's growing commercial arteries. It was honest work, and it fit Rockefeller's temperament perfectly: buying, selling, calculating, optimizing. And then, far away in Pennsylvania, someone punched a hole in the ground and hit a river of opportunity. In 1859, Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville. The headlines called it a miracle. Men rushed into the hills like prospectors chasing a new kind of gold. Wells went up overnight. Fortunes appeared and evaporated just as fast. Prices swung wildly. Towns exploded into existence and collapsed into mud. It looked like madness. Rockefeller watched it and felt something different. Not excitement, clarity. Because the oil boom wasn't just about oil. It was about disorder. And disorder always creates a demand for one thing: control. Rockefeller had no interest in drilling. The men who drilled were gamblers, and gambling was his father's world. They bet everything on a hole in the ground, then prayed the earth loved them back. But refining, transport, distribution, contracts, accounting, that was Rockefeller's religion. He understood something that would define the next half-century of American capitalism. When an industry is chaotic, the person who builds the system becomes king. The drillers would take the risk. He would build the machine that turned their risk into steady profit, and he would do it the way he did everything else, quietly, methodically, one transaction at a time, until the world looked up and realized the rules had changed. Because the boy who celebrated 50 cents a day had already learned the most dangerous lesson in business: if you can measure it, you can master it, and if you can master it, you can own it. Not just the product, not just the company, the entire game. In the next chapter we enter the oil chaos, barrels overflowing, prices collapsing, men getting rich by accident. And we'll watch Rockefeller do what he always did. He won't chase the gold, he'll build the standard. On August 27th, 1859, a man named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. 25 barrels a day. That was all it took. Within months, the quiet hills of western Pennsylvania transformed into something that looked less like industry and more like fever. Farmers abandoned fields. Shopkeepers closed stores. Men arrived with shovels, wooden derricks, borrowed money, and impossible hope. Wells were drilled wherever land could be leased. Forests were cut down overnight. Towns sprang up in weeks. Hotels, saloons, boarding houses, gambling halls, then flooded with mud when the rains came. Oil seeped into rivers. Barrels overflowed. Fortunes appeared in the morning and vanished by winter. It was not a business yet. It was a rush. Prices swung wildly. At one moment, crude oil sold for $10 a barrel. Weeks later, oversupply drove it to 10 cents. There were no pipelines, no storage systems, no long-term contracts. When a well struck oil, the producer often had no place to put it. Wooden tanks leaked. Railcars were scarce. Entire fields of petroleum soaked uselessly into the ground. The men drilling wells were gamblers, and gamblers lived by emotion. John D. Rockefeller watched the spectacle from Cleveland with something close to detachment. He saw headlines and heard stories of overnight millionaires. He saw men buying silk vests and losing everything a season later. But Rockefeller did not envy them. He analyzed them. The drillers assumed the risk. They spent capital digging holes into rock with no guarantee of return. Some struck black gold. Many struck nothing. The oil fields produced chaos, unpredictable supply, unstable prices, no quality control. But chaos always produces opportunity for someone who does not need excitement. The real money, Rockefeller realized, would not be in drilling oil. It would be in refining it. Crude petroleum was nearly useless in its raw form. It smelled foul. It burned dangerously. It required chemical processing to become kerosene, cleaner, brighter, safer fuel for lamps. At the time, a whale oil was expensive and growing scarce. Cities needed light, factories needed lubrication, homes needed illumination after sunset. Oil was not just a commodity, it was infrastructure waiting to happen, an infrastructure rewards order. In 1863, Rockefeller and his partner Morris Clark invested in a small refinery in Cleveland operated by a chemist named Samuel Andrews. Andrews understood the technical process: distillation, separation, purification. Rockefeller understood cost. Cleveland was a strategic advantage disguised as a city. Rail lines intersected there, Lake Erie offered cheap transport east. Pennsylvania crude could be shipped in. Refined kerosene could be shipped out. Geography, once combined with discipline, could become dominance. Rockefeller studied the refinery like a surgeon studies anatomy. How much crude per barrel? How much waste? How much labour per shift? How much leakage? How much freight per mile? Every inefficiency offended him personally. Where others saw oil as a golden river, Rockefeller saw numbers, and numbers could be improved. He negotiated lower prices for barrels. He calculated the exact cost of sulfuric acid used in refining. He insisted on recovering byproducts others discarded: lubricants, paraffin, naphtha. Nothing wasted. Even waste had value if processed correctly. This was not romantic capitalism, it was mechanical. Meanwhile, the oil fields remained unstable. Wells flooded markets, then dried up. Speculators bought and sold leases like lottery tickets. Railroads charged inconsistent freight rates depending on leverage and relationships, and here Rockefeller saw his opening. Railroads were desperate for volume. Oil shipments were increasing rapidly, but refiners shipped irregularly. Rockefeller approached rail companies with a proposal that was simple and devastating. Guarantee us lower rates. In exchange, we guarantee you steady, massive volume. The railroads agreed. It was logical. If Standard Oil could promise dozens of carloads per day, the railroad earned predictable revenue. Smaller refiners, shipping sporadically, paid higher rates. This practice, volume discounts, was legal and common in other industries. But in oil, it changed everything. Because oil refining had thin margins, a difference of a few cents per barrel in shipping could mean survival or collapse. Rockefeller understood scale before scale became fashionable. He and a new partner, Henry Flagler, ambitious, disciplined, and fearless in negotiation, expanded relentlessly. They reinvested profits instead of withdrawing them. They acquired additional refineries. They purchased their own barrel manufacturing operations. They built storage facilities. Every function they could control, they controlled. And here lies the critical shift. Most businessmen tried to compete. Rockefeller tried to integrate. He wanted no dependency that could threaten stability. Together they started a commission business dealing in grain, hay, meat. Whatever moved through Cleveland's growing commercial arteries. It was honest work and it fit Rockefeller's temperament perfectly. Buying, selling, calculating, optimizing. And then, far away in Pennsylvania, someone punched a hole in the ground and hit a river of opportunity. In 1859, Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville. The headlines called it a miracle. Men rushed into the hills like prospectors chasing a new kind of gold. Wells went up overnight. Fortunes appeared and evaporated just as fast. Prices swung wildly. Towns exploded into existence and collapsed into mud. It looked like madness. Rockefeller watched it and felt something different. Not excitement, clarity. Because the oil boom wasn't just about oil. It was about disorder. And disorder always creates a demand for one thing: control. Rockefeller had no interest in drilling. The men who drilled were gamblers, and gambling was his father's world. They bet everything on a hole in the ground, then prayed the earth loved them back. But refining, transport, distribution, contracts, accounting, that was Rockefeller's religion. He understood something that would define the next half-century of American capitalism. When an industry is chaotic, the person who builds the system becomes king. The drillers would take the risk. He would build the machine that turned their risk into steady profit, and he would do it the way he did everything else. Quietly, methodically, one transaction at a time, until the world looked up and realized the rules had changed, because the boy who celebrated 50 cents a day had already learned the most dangerous lesson in business. If you can measure it, you can master it. And if you can master it, you can own it. Not just the product, not just the company, the entire game. In the next chapter, we enter the oil chaos, barrels overflowing, prices collapsing, men getting rich by accident. And we'll watch Rockefeller do what he always did. He won't chase the gold, he'll build the standard. By the early 1870s, the oil rush no longer smelled like opportunity. It smelled like smoke. Refineries crowded Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. Barrels stacked in muddy yards. Rail lines jammed with tank cars. Prices crashed, rebounded, crashed again. Dozens of refiners fought for the same markets, cutting rates to survive. To many businessmen, this was competition. To John D. Rockefeller, it was waste, and waste was intolerable. He had no interest in being the biggest refiner among many. He wanted to build a machine that made competition irrelevant. The first breakthrough was not a refinery purchase, it was information. Rockefeller knew that control begins with knowledge. He gathered data obsessively: production levels, shipping rates, output quality, margins, and distant markets. He built relationships with railroad executives and understood their desperation. Railroads were overbuilt and underpaid. They needed guaranteed traffic to survive. Rockefeller offered them certainty. If Standard Oil shipped the majority of petroleum, railroads would operate at capacity. In return, Standard demanded lower rates, sometimes significantly lower. But the arrangement went further. Railroads often agreed to rebates on Standard shipments and, in some cases, drawbacks on competitors' shipments, meaning Standard received a portion of the freight charged to rival refiners. It was not technically illegal at the time, but it was devastating. Imagine trying to compete in a race where your rival pays less for fuel and receives cash every time you buy yours. Small refiners discovered they were losing money even when they matched Standard's prices. They could not see the invisible agreements behind the scenes. They only saw collapse. Rockefeller saw efficiency. He argued that his large, predictable shipments justified lower rates. Railroads agreed. Smaller refiners protested. State legislatures muttered. But the machine kept growing. In 1872, Rockefeller launched what critics later called the Cleveland Massacre. Within months, he acquired 22 of 26 Cleveland refineries. Some owners resisted. Most did the math. Rockefeller would sit across the table calmly and show them numbers. He would explain Standard's freight advantage, its economies of scale, its superior facilities. He would not threaten. He did not need to. The implication hung in the air: sell now and receive Standard Oil stock, or stay independent and fight a war you cannot win. Many chose stock. They became wealthy as Standard grew. Others held out and watched their margins evaporate. Rockefeller never raised his voice. He never pounded the table. He presented arithmetic as destiny. And arithmetic rarely loses, but consolidation of refineries was only the beginning. The real genius of Standard Oil was integration. Most companies in the oil business did one thing: drill, refine, transport, or sell. Standard did all of it. Pipelines were constructed to move crude oil directly from fields to refineries, bypassing railroads when necessary. Barrel-making operations were absorbed to control costs. Warehouses and distribution networks were expanded. Even foreign marketing offices were established to push kerosene into Europe and Asia. Standard Oil did not simply refine petroleum. It controlled the journey from ground to lamp. Every step eliminated uncertainty. Every acquisition reduced vulnerability. Every contract locked in predictability. This was not greed in the theatrical sense. It was engineering. Rockefeller treated business like a system of pipes and valves. Pressure must be controlled. Flow must be steady. Leaks must be sealed. If a competitor disrupted pressure, that competitor would be absorbed or removed. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil's dominance was unmistakable. Refiners across the country faced the same choice Cleveland had faced: join the machine or be ground by it. Rockefeller's headquarters at 26 Broadway in Lower Manhattan became the quiet command center of a continental empire. There were no dramatic speeches, no public spectacles. Decisions were made behind closed doors by men who spoke softly and kept immaculate records. The press began to circle. Journalists heard complaints from ruined refiners. Politicians received letters accusing Standard of strangling free enterprise. Cartoons appeared in newspapers depicting a monstrous octopus labeled Standard Oil, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, banks, state houses, even the US Capitol. The imagery was powerful. It was also accurate. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. Not drilling, refining. The critical choke point between chaos and commerce. Rockefeller had not conquered the oil fields. He had conquered the processing, which meant he could dictate terms. Yet in his own mind, he was not a villain. He believed he had rescued the oil industry from ruin. Before Standard, refiners went bankrupt regularly. Workers lost jobs. Consumers received inconsistent fuel. Prices fluctuated violently. Under Standard, prices for kerosene actually fell over time, quality improved, supply stabilized. To Rockefeller, this proved moral legitimacy. If consumers benefited, how could the structure be wrong? But capitalism in America had been built on an ideal: open competition. Standard Oil had replaced competition with coordination, and coordination, when controlled by a single entity, is indistinguishable from monopoly. Rockefeller understood public perception better than many assume. He lived modestly. He avoided ostentation. He did not build a Fifth Avenue palace like the Vanderbilts. He dressed plainly. He attended church faithfully. He handed out dimes to children. But modesty could not hide scale. The machine had grown too large. States began investigating. Lawsuits were filed. Legislators debated new regulations. Rockefeller responded the way he always did, with structure. In 1882, Standard Oil created something unprecedented: the Standard Oil Trust. 40 separate companies across multiple states transferred their stock to 9 trustees, led by Rockefeller. In return, shareholders received trust certificates. On paper, the companies were separate. In practice, they were one organism. Unified management, centralized control, coordinated pricing. It was a legal innovation designed to overcome state laws that limited corporate expansion across borders. It also changed American business forever. Other industries copied the model: sugar, steel, whiskey, cotton oil. The word trust entered public vocabulary as shorthand for concentrated corporate power. Rockefeller had not just built a company, he had invented a template. By the time he turned 60, he had largely stepped back from daily operations. His fortune was beyond imagination. Hundreds of millions of dollars in an era when the average worker earned less than $500 per year. But the machine he built did not slow. It expanded internationally. It influenced politics. It shaped markets. And it attracted enemies, because machines that large cast shadows. In the next chapter, the octopus grows visible, and a woman with patience, documents, and a quiet fury begins writing the story that will change everything. By the 1880s, Standard Oil was no longer just a company. It was a presence. You felt it in freight rates. You saw it in contracts. You heard it in the complaints of ruined businessmen. Even if you never bought a barrel of kerosene yourself, you lived inside a system shaped by it. And systems, once large enough, become visible. Newspapers began printing cartoons that captured the public mood. One of them would become famous: a giant octopus rising from the ocean, its tentacles wrapped around railroads, steel companies, state legislatures, even the US Capitol itself. The head of the octopus bore a single name: Standard Oil. The image was theatrical. It was also persuasive. By 1880, Standard refined roughly 90% of American petroleum. It had not conquered every oil well, but it controlled the bottleneck, the place where crude became usable, and whoever controls the bottleneck controls the market. Rockefeller, by temperament, disliked publicity. He avoided interviews. He declined invitations. He preferred quiet offices and careful memos to speeches and applause. But his invisibility was beginning to look like guilt. Critics argued that Standard did not merely compete, it suffocated. Refiners who resisted acquisition found themselves unable to secure affordable freight. Prices in their regions suddenly dropped to levels that guaranteed losses. Suppliers hesitated to extend credit. Banks grew cautious. Individually, each move could be explained. Collectively, they resembled strategy. Rockefeller rejected the word monopoly. In his mind, monopoly suggested coercion. He believed Standard had simply outperformed rivals. Its scale reduced waste. Its integration stabilized prices. Its discipline eliminated chaos. To him, consolidation was rational. To his opponents, it was domination. The political atmosphere of the United States was shifting. The nation had entered what historians would later call the Gilded Age, a period of enormous industrial growth layered over widening inequality. Railroad tycoons, steel magnates, financiers, and oil barons amassed fortunes beyond comprehension. At the same time, workers endured unstable wages and dangerous conditions. Industrial capitalism was producing miracles and misery in equal measure, and Standard Oil became the symbol of both. In 1882, Rockefeller formalized his empire into the Standard Oil Trust. 40 companies placed their shares under the control of 9 trustees. It was a legal innovation, a workaround to state restrictions on corporate expansion, but it also looked like something new and unsettling. a corporation that behaved like a nation. From 26 Broadway in Manhattan, Rockefeller and his associates coordinated decisions that affected markets across continents. Tankers crossed oceans, pipelines snaked through states, refineries operated like synchronized organs. The trust model spread quickly. Sugar refiners, whiskey producers, and other industrialists copied it. The word trust became shorthand for concentrated power, and concentrated power invites resistance. Farmers complained about freight discrimination. Small businessmen resented being absorbed or destroyed. Politicians began to campaign against the trusts as a matter of patriotic duty. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The law was brief, almost vague. It declared illegal any contract, combination, or conspiracy and restraint of trade. It outlawed monopolization. At first, it was largely symbolic. Courts interpreted it narrowly. Enforcement was weak. But the idea had entered American law. No private entity should dominate an entire industry unchecked. Rockefeller, already easing into semi-retirement, watched calmly. He believed Standard's structure would survive legal scrutiny. He believed its efficiency justified its scale. He may also have believed that the government lacked the will to challenge him. For years, that belief held true. But something else was happening beyond courtrooms and Congress. Something slower and potentially more powerful. Public opinion was turning. In Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in oil towns where independent refiners had vanished, memories hardened into resentment. Stories accumulated, quiet conversations about rebates, about secret agreements, about sudden collapses. These stories lacked documentation. They lacked structure. They needed someone methodical, someone patient, someone who understood that the way to challenge a machine was not with emotion, but with evidence. In 1902, that person appeared. Her name was Ida Minerva Tarbell. She had grown up in the oil regions of Pennsylvania. She had watched independent producers struggle. She had seen fortunes evaporate. She did not shout. She did not exaggerate. She researched. For 2 years, she gathered documents, interviewed former employees, studied court records, and traced the rise of Standard Oil piece by piece. She wrote with precision, not fury. The first installment of her series appeared in McClure's magazine in November 1902. It did not accuse, it revealed. Readers encountered a careful reconstruction of railroad rebates, acquisitions, and strategic price wars. They saw names, dates, and figures. They saw patterns emerge from paperwork. The octopus gained anatomy. Circulation soared. Each new installment deepened the narrative. Rockefeller's silence, intended as dignity, looked like avoidance. For the first time, the story of Standard Oil was no longer told by its architects. It was told by an investigator. The power of Tarbell's work was not sensationalism. It was clarity. She demonstrated that Standard Oil's dominance had not arisen from pure efficiency alone, but from tactics designed to eliminate alternatives. The public absorbed this slowly, then decisively. Trust-busting became more than rhetoric. It became policy. Presidents began to view monopolies as threats not merely to markets, but to democracy itself. Rockefeller had built a machine so efficient it seemed inevitable. Tarbell's writing made it questionable, and once something becomes questionable, it becomes vulnerable. In the next chapter, the government steps in, not with cartoons or editorials, but with lawsuits. The octopus will be tested in court, and the outcome will reshape American capitalism forever. By the time the government finally moved against Standard Oil, the empire had already reshaped the American economy. The question was no longer whether Rockefeller was powerful. The question was whether that power was legal. In 1906, under President Theodore Roosevelt, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Roosevelt had built his public reputation as a trust buster, determined to challenge corporate combinations that threatened competition. Railroads had already felt pressure. Meatpacking companies had been investigated. Now the largest and most visible trust in America stood in the crosshairs. The case was filed in Missouri, where Standard operated through subsidiaries. The government's argument was direct. Standard Oil had conspired to restrain trade, eliminate competitors, and monopolize the petroleum industry through unfair methods. Standard's attorneys responded with calm confidence. They argued that dominance alone was not a crime, that efficiency, Scale and superior organization naturally led to market leadership. They pointed to falling kerosene prices over decades as proof that consumers benefited from consolidation. If prices dropped and quality improved, where was the harm? The courtroom became a battleground not just of law, but of philosophy. Was capitalism meant to reward the most efficient organization, even if it consumed all rivals? Or was competition itself the essential principle that must be preserved, even if it produced waste? The trial stretched on for months. More than 400 witnesses testified. Thousands of documents were entered into evidence. Contracts, freight agreements, internal memos. The quiet deals that had once lived in filing cabinets were now recited aloud before judges and reporters. Rockefeller himself was called to testify. He was 67 years old, thinner than in his prime, his hair long gone from alopecia, his voice soft. He had already stepped back from day-to-day management. Technically, he was not running Standard Oil anymore, but everyone knew whose architecture had built the system. His testimony was careful. He claimed limited memory of specific transactions. He deferred to subordinates. He described his actions as efforts to bring order to chaos. He did not appear defiant. He appeared composed. To supporters, he looked like a disciplined businessman misunderstood by politicians. To critics, he looked evasive. In 1909, the lower federal court ruled against Standard Oil. The company had violated the Sherman Act. It had used unreasonable methods to maintain monopoly power. Standard appealed immediately. The case rose to the United States Supreme Court. On May 15, 1911, the decision came down. The court affirmed the ruling. Standard Oil had engaged in practices that constituted unreasonable restraint of trade. The monopoly must be dissolved. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White introduced what became known as the rule of reason. Not every large company was illegal. Only those whose behaviour unreasonably restricted competition. Standard Oil's record, the court concluded, crossed that line. The empire had 6 months to break apart. The octopus would be cut into pieces. Standard Oil was reorganized into 34 separate companies. Among them was Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of Indiana, entities that would later become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron and Amoco. On paper, the monopoly was destroyed. In reality, the story was more complicated. The same shareholders who once held Standard Oil stock now held shares in 34 independent companies. Rockefeller remained a major shareholder in many of them, and as markets adjusted, something unexpected happened. The stock values of the new companies rose. Freed from the legal overhang of a single monopolistic structure, investors gained confidence. The individual companies expanded aggressively into new regions and products. Rockefeller's personal fortune, already immense, tripled within a few years. The man the government sought to diminish became wealthier than ever. It was one of the great ironies in American economic history. The Supreme Court had destroyed the structure, but it had multiplied the value. Rockefeller did not publicly celebrate. By then, he was more focused on philanthropy than on daily business affairs. He spent much of his time at his estate overlooking the Hudson River, walking gardens and playing golf. Yet the system he built had proven resilient. Standard Oil no longer existed as a single organism, but its fragments thrived. The energy infrastructure of the 20th century, gasoline for automobiles, lubricants for industry, petrochemicals for manufacturing, flowed through the descendants of his creation. The trial marked a turning point in American law. It established that no corporation, however powerful, stood above federal authority. It defined the boundaries of monopoly for generations, but it did not end the Rockefeller story. If anything, it shifted its focus. Because as the old man retreated from public controversy and the oil empire reorganized, another crisis was brewing, one that would stain the family name in blood rather than ink. The next chapter would not unfold in a courtroom, it would unfold in a coalfield. And it would force Rockefeller's son to confront the human cost of distance. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had built his fortune through distance. Distance from oil fields, distance from refineries, distance from the human friction of industry. He worked through ledgers, contracts, intermediaries. He rarely shouted. He rarely appeared. His empire functioned because systems replace personalities. But distance has a cost. And in 1914, that cost arrived in the form of smoke rising over a Colorado tent colony. By then, Rockefeller Sr. had largely withdrawn from business. The empire remained vast, But operational authority had passed to executives and increasingly to his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Jr. was nothing like his father. He was devout, cautious, intensely moral in temperament. Where Senior possessed a quiet steel, Jr. carried visible tension. He had grown up under the weight of public resentment toward the Rockefeller name. He understood that to millions of Americans their wealth symbolized injustice, but he also inherited responsibility. Among the family's investments was a controlling interest in the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, one of the largest coal producers in the American West. Coal-powered railroads, steel mills, cities. It was the muscle of industrial America. It was also brutal. Mining towns in Colorado were company towns. Workers were often paid in scrip redeemable only at company stores. They rented company-owned housing. Safety conditions were dangerous. The death rate in Colorado mines was among the highest in the country. In September 1913, miners went on strike. They demanded enforcement of state safety laws, better wages, recognition of their union, and the right to choose their own housing and doctors. Colorado Fuel and Iron refused. When miners walked out, they were evicted from company housing. Families, men, women, children, moved into tent colonies on the open prairie. The largest camp was near a rail stop called Ludlow. Winter came early that year. Snow covered the tents, the wind cut through canvas, yet the strike held. Junior received reports from company managers describing the strikers as agitators, influenced by outside radicals. He had never visited the mines. His understanding of events came filtered through correspondence. From New York offices, the situation looked manageable. On the ground, it was volatile. The Colorado National Guard was called in to maintain order. Tensions escalated over months. There were skirmishes, shots fired in the dark, suspicion thickened. Then, on April 20th, 1914, the confrontation exploded. National Guardsmen, some reportedly on company payroll, opened fire on the Ludlow tent colony. Machine guns rattled across the camp. Tents caught fire. Families fled or hid in pits dug beneath the canvas for shelter. When the smoke cleared, at least 20 people were dead, including women and children who had suffocated in the underground shelters. The Ludlow Massacre. Photographs of burned tents and lifeless bodies spread across newspapers nationwide. Suddenly, the Rockefeller name was not associated with oil monopolies or antitrust debates. It was associated with dead children. Protests erupted outside Rockefeller offices in Manhattan. Demonstrators gathered near the family estate in New York. Editorials condemned the family as indifferent aristocrats presiding over industrial feudalism. Junior was summoned to testify before the U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations. Under questioning, he insisted he had not ordered violence. He expressed sorrow, but defended his managers. He maintained that the company had acted lawfully. The answers sounded procedural. The public mood was emotional. For the first time, the Rockefeller legacy faced not legal jeopardy, but moral collapse. Junior was devastated. Though he had not directed troops, he understood that ownership carried responsibility. The distance that had once protected the empire now looked like indifference. He sought advice. One of the advisors he hired was Ivy Lee, a pioneer in what would later be called public relations. Lee proposed something radical: transparency. Instead of hiding behind statements, Junior would go to Colorado. He would meet miners face to face. In 1915, Junior traveled west. He toured mines. He met workers and their families. He listened publicly. Photographers captured him shaking hands, speaking with miners' wives, walking through company towns. Some dismissed it as performance. But something in Junior shifted. He began advocating reforms within Colorado Fuel and Iron, introducing worker representation plans, safety improvements, and mechanisms for employee grievances. Critics argued these reforms fell short of union recognition. But they marked a departure from the distant management style that had defined the family. Ludlow became a scar. It also became a pivot. Junior recognized that wealth without visible responsibility invited disaster. The Rockefeller name would not survive another crisis like this. If Senior had built the fortune through discipline, Neon integration, Junior would attempt to rebuild its reputation through stewardship. The transition would not happen overnight. But the seeds were planted in Colorado's snow. The family that once symbolized corporate ruthlessness would begin redirecting its vast resources towards something else: public institutions, cultural projects, conservation, global health, not as random charity, as strategy. Because Junior understood a lesson his father had mastered in business. Systems endure longer than reactions. If the Rockefeller name was to endure, it would need a new system, one designed not for domination, but for legitimacy. And the physical embodiment of that new phase was already rising on a hill overlooking the Hudson River. In the next chapter, we climb that hill. We enter Kykuit, the lookout, and examine how architecture became the stage for a dynasty's reinvention. High above the Hudson River, in the rolling hills of Bocantico, stands a house that does not look like a monument. It looks like restraint. Fieldstone walls, Indiana limestone trim, a sloping roofline softened by trees. From a distance, Kykuit blends into the landscape as if it had grown there naturally. The name comes from the Dutch word for lookout, and that is precisely what it is. From its terraces, the river curves south toward Manhattan. The Palisades rise across the water. Forested hills stretch outward in layers of muted green and blue. It is a place designed for perspective. John D. Rockefeller purchased the land in the 1890s. At first, there was a simpler house on the property. It burned in 1902, forcing a decision. Rockefeller was in his 70s. He had outlived rivals, lawsuits, investigations. The Standard Oil Trust had been dismantled. His fortune, paradoxically, had grown larger than ever. Now he would build something permanent. But permanence did not mean extravagance. Rockefeller disliked ostentation. He had watched other industrial magnates construct marble palaces along Fifth Avenue and in Newport, monuments to wealth meant to intimidate and impress. That was not his style. He wanted order. He wanted privacy. He wanted control. The architectural firm Delano and Aldrich designed the house. The early version, however, disappointed him. Chimneys smoked poorly. Service entrances disrupted bedrooms. The structure looked impressive but functioned imperfectly. Imperfection was unacceptable. William Wells Bosworth was brought in to refine both house and landscape. Rooflines were adjusted. A service tunnel was built beneath the approach road so that deliveries could arrive unseen. Terraces were shaped into geometric precision. Gardens unfolded in descending stages, each framed deliberately to capture a different slice of horizon. The result was not a palace. It was a system. Kykuit was completed in 1913, just 1 year before Ludlow. The timing was ironic. As public anger toward the Rockefeller name reached a new peak, the family settled into an estate that embodied calm, control, and long-term vision. Inside, the rooms reflected discipline rather than excess. Interiors designed by Ogden Codman avoided clutter. Chinese porcelains lined shelves, English furniture anchored drawing rooms, portraits of American founders hung on walls, Lincoln, Washington, figures associated with national unity rather than private fortune. There was no grand ballroom, no excessive ornamentation. The house was large, 40 rooms, but not theatrical. Senior walked the grounds daily when health permitted. He read scripture. He played golf on a private course. He gave dimes to children he encountered, an eccentric ritual that newspapers mocked as symbolic of miserliness. But those dimes were not random. They were consistent. Consistency defined him. Kykuit became his refuge during his final decades. He died there in 1937 at the age of 97. But the house was never meant for a single lifetime. Junior inherited the estate and transformed it further. Where Senior preferred simplicity, Junior cultivated collections. Chinese ceramics from multiple dynasties, European tapestries, carefully curated antiques. The house evolved from residence into archive, and then came the third generation. Nelson Rockefeller, ambitious, energetic, restless, brought something entirely new to the hilltop, modern art. If Senior embodied discipline and Junior embodied redemption, Nelson embodied expression. Beginning in the mid-20th century, Nelson filled the estate's lower galleries with works by Picasso, Matisse, Chagall, Kandinsky, and other masters of modernism. Sculptures by Henry Moore, Alexander Calder, and Isamu Noguchi appeared among the formal gardens. Helicopters lowered massive sculptures onto the lawns because no road could accommodate them. The juxtaposition was deliberate. Classical terraces met abstract steel forms. Old-world symmetry met 20th century experimentation. The estate became a conversation across generations, the founder's structured restraint, the son's institutional responsibility, the grandson's cultural ambition. Kykuit was no longer merely a home, it was a stage for legacy. Outside its gates, America had transformed. Automobiles replaced horses, oil shifted from kerosene to gasoline, the descendants of Standard Oil expanded into global corporations. Political debates about corporate power continued through new industries. But on the Hill, the view remained constant. That view mattered. Rockefeller had chosen the site because it offered distance. Not just physical distance from Manhattan's noise, but perspective. From here, one could see long lines of geography unfolding beyond immediate conflict. The house symbolized something larger than wealth. It symbolized duration. While other Gilded Age mansions were sold, demolished, or converted into museums detached from family control, Kykuit remained a living center for Rockefeller gatherings. Generations met there. Decisions were discussed. Foundations were planned. Strategies refined. The family's transformation, from monopolists to philanthropists, did not occur in abstract boardrooms alone. It unfolded in rooms overlooking the Hudson. Architecture in this sense became argument. The house argued that wealth could evolve, that dynasties could shift from extraction to preservation, that a name once synonymous with monopoly might become synonymous with institutions, universities, foundations, museums. Yet the tension never disappeared entirely. Every terrace, every sculpture, every carefully clipped hedge stood atop a fortune built in an age of ruthless consolidation. Kykuit did not erase that history. It framed it, and framing changes perception. In the next chapter, we step beyond the house itself and examine how the Rockefeller fortune was transformed into something unprecedented, a philanthropic machine designed to outlive markets, governments, and even the family name. If John D. Rockefeller had built a machine to control oil, his son would build a machine to distribute power. Not political power, moral power, institutional power. The idea was radical for its time. Before Rockefeller, wealthy Americans gave money in fragments. They funded churches, libraries, hospitals. They attached their names to buildings. They donated in response to emotion. Famine here, disaster there. Rockefeller wanted something else. Systematic philanthropy. In 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation was formally established. Its mission was ambitious in language and sweeping in intent, to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world. Not Cleveland, not New York, the world. This was not charity. It was strategy. Rockefeller believed that money could solve problems the way engineering solved inefficiencies. Study the root cause, measure it, attack it with precision, evaluate results, adjust, scale. He applied the same discipline that had built Standard Oil, only now the product was public good. One of the Foundation's earliest targets was hookworm. In the early 20th century, millions in the American South suffered from the parasite. It entered through bare feet, infected the intestines, and drained energy from its victims. Chronic fatigue was common. Productivity was low. Poverty seemed cultural. It was biological. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission launched a campaign in 1909. Doctors travelled through rural communities testing children and adults. They provided medication. They taught sanitation practices. They collected data obsessively. The results were measurable. Infection rates dropped. School attendance rose. Work output increased. For the first time, philanthropy had been executed like public health policy. The campaign expanded internationally. Within years, Rockefeller-funded programs were operating across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Yellow fever became another focus. Researchers funded by the Foundation risked their lives in tropical climates to develop treatments and prevention strategies. In 1937, a yellow fever vaccine emerged from research supported by Rockefeller funds. The scientist responsible would later receive a Nobel Prize. Medical education was next. In 1910, educator Abraham Flexner published a report exposing the poor quality of many American medical schools. Standards were inconsistent. Training was inadequate. The Rockefeller family funded reforms, supporting universities, modern laboratories, and structured clinical education. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research became one of the most prestigious biomedical institutions in the world. The giving was not sentimental, it was architectural. Rather than respond to suffering, the Foundation attempted to redesign the systems that produced it. Agriculture offered another frontier. In the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller Foundation helped fund agricultural research that would later contribute to what became known as the Green Revolution. Improved crop varieties and farming techniques dramatically increased yields in parts of Asia and Latin America, reducing the threat of famine for millions. Critics argued that such interventions carried geopolitical motives, that philanthropy blurred into influence. They were not entirely wrong. When money moves at global scale, it shapes priorities. But for Junior, the motivation remained rooted in responsibility. The Ludlow massacre had changed him. He understood that ownership without engagement invited disaster. Philanthropy became not only redemption, but insulation, proof that the Rockefeller fortune served more than private accumulation. Education was central. The University of Chicago, funded heavily by Rockefeller, rose rapidly to global prominence. The General Education Board supported schools across the South. Grants flowed to teachers' colleges, rural schools, and universities. Junior's wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, introduced another dimension: modern art. In 1929, she co-founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. At the time, many Americans dismissed modernism as strange, foreign, even dangerous. Abby believed it represented the future. MoMA would become one of the most influential art institutions in the world. The Rockefeller name began to shift, from oil barrels to research labs, from octopus cartoons to museum walls, from monopoly hearings to university endowments. Yet the transformation was not universally applauded. Critics argued that billionaire philanthropy allowed private families to shape public priorities, that foundations became parallel governments, directing resources without democratic oversight. There was truth in that. When a family controls hundreds of millions of dollars, its decisions influence nations. But the Rockefeller model also introduced accountability. Foundations required reports. They demanded metrics. They funded research that was peer-reviewed and scrutinized. It was not pure benevolence. It was institutional power redirected. Junior himself became deeply involved in conservation. He donated land for national parks. He funded preservation efforts in the Great Smoky Mountains and Grand Teton. He supported historic restoration in Williamsburg, Virginia, reconstructing colonial buildings brick by brick. He saw continuity as valuable. Preserve landscapes, preserve history, preserve legitimacy. By the time Junior died in 1960, he had given away more than $500 million, an astronomical sum for his era. Combined with his father's philanthropy, the first two generations directed over $1 billion into institutions. The giving engine ran continuously, and unlike oil refineries, it did not pollute. But it did something else. It reshaped reputation. The Rockefeller name, once synonymous with monopoly, now appeared engraved on universities, research institutes, art museums, and parkways. Redemption is rarely pure. It is layered. The same wealth that crushed competitors funded disease eradication. The same fortune associated with Ludlow financed conservation and education. The contradiction remained, but so did the impact. In the next chapter, we follow the third generation, the grandson who would bring politics, modern art, and presidential ambition to the Rockefeller story. By the time the third generation came of age, the Rockefeller name no longer meant only oil. It meant institutions, it meant foundations, it meant responsibility, but it also meant expectation. And no one carried that expectation more visibly than Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. Born in 1908, Nelson was the grandson of the founder and the son of the reformer. He inherited not just wealth, but narrative. His grandfather had built, his father had redeemed. What, then, would he do? Nelson chose expansion, not of oil, but of influence. From an early age, he showed little interest in bookkeeping or quiet management. Where senior preferred ledgers and junior preferred committees, Nelson preferred action. He had his mother Abby's enthusiasm for art and his grandfather's appetite for scale. Modern art became his first frontier. While many Americans still regarded abstract painting with suspicion, Nelson embraced it. He collected works by Picasso, Matisse, Chagall, Kandinsky, and later by emerging American artists. He believed modern art was not decorative, it was cultural infrastructure. Under his influence, the Museum of Modern Art expanded dramatically. Exhibitions introduced Americans to European avant-garde movements. Sculpture gardens redefined how art interacted with public space. What had once seemed radical became canonical. But Nelson did not confine himself to culture. He entered politics. In 1958, he was elected governor of New York. His tenure would stretch across 4 terms, an extraordinary run. He expanded the State University of New York system, investing heavily in higher education. He championed infrastructure projects, urban development, and the arts. His vision was ambitious, sometimes controversial. Critics accused him of overspending. Supporters praised his energy and scale of thinking. Nelson embodied a version of republicanism that now feels distant, internationalist, pro-government investment, culturally engaged. He sought the Republican presidential nomination 3 times. Each time he failed. The party was changing, the country was changing, but Nelson persisted. In 1974, amid the constitutional crisis following President Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford appointed Nelson Rockefeller as Vice President of the United States. It was a historic appointment, only the second time someone reached the office without election. For the Rockefeller family, it marked a symbolic peak. The grandson of a man once caricatured as an octopus strangling democracy now stood a heartbeat away from the presidency. Politics, however, is less stable than philanthropy. Nelson's tenure as vice president was brief. By 1977, he had stepped away from federal office. His public career ended not in defeat, but in transition. He returned to what had always grounded him: art and legacy. At Kykuit, the estate overlooking the Hudson, Nelson transformed the grounds into an outdoor museum of modern sculpture. Massive works by Henry Moore, Alexander Calder, David Smith, and Osamu Noguchi appeared among the formal gardens designed decades earlier. The contrast was intentional. Classical symmetry met abstract steel. Old wealth met modern form. The estate became a physical metaphor for evolution. If the first generation represented industrial power, and the second moral recalibration, the third embodied cultural ambition. But ambition carries risk. Nelson died in 1979 under circumstances that fueled public gossip and private embarrassment. Though details were less dramatic than rumour suggested, the event reminded observers that dynasties are human, not mythic. Other members of the third generation carved distinct paths. David Rockefeller, the youngest of Junior's sons, became chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and a significant figure in global finance. He lived to the age of 101, witnessing transformations in banking and geopolitics that stretched far beyond his grandfather's world. Winthrop Rockefeller became governor of Arkansas. John D. Rockefeller III focused on philanthropy and population issues. Lawrence Rockefeller championed environmental preservation and venture investments in emerging industries. The family diversified, not only financially, but ideologically and culturally. The oil fortune fragmented across trusts and foundations. Wealth remained significant, but no longer centralized in a single commanding figure. The dynasty had transitioned from singular authority to distributed influence, and through it all Kykuit remained the anchor. Family gatherings continued on the estate. Decisions about foundations, investments, and preservation were discussed under the same roof that once sheltered the founder. Few Gilded Age fortunes survived intact into the 21st century. The Vanderbilts' wealth dissipated within generations. The Carnegies gave much away and left little dynastic continuity. The Rockefellers did something different. They institutionalized themselves. Trust structures preserved assets. Foundations structured giving. Professional managers oversaw investments. The family maintained collective identity through shared governance. This was not accidental. It was engineered, and that engineering allowed the Rockefeller name to evolve without disappearing. But endurance invites a deeper question. What does it mean when a fortune built in an era of ruthless consolidation continues shaping public life generations later? Is it proof of wisdom, or proof that power, once accumulated, rarely truly dissolves? In the next chapter, we step away from personalities and examine the legacy itself, the institutions, the impact, and the unresolved tension between origin and outcome. By the time the 20th century turned toward its final decades, the Rockefeller story no longer centered on oil. It centered on institutions, universities, research laboratories, museums, parks. The Rockefeller Foundation operated across continents. Grants moved through medical research centers, agricultural institutes, public health campaigns. The University of Chicago stood as a powerhouse of scholarship. The Museum of Modern Art shaped cultural taste. National parks bore the imprint of Rockefeller conservation. If one judged purely by impact, the scale was staggering. Scientists funded by Rockefeller institutions received Nobel Prizes. Public health campaigns reduced disease across multiple continents. Agricultural research increased crop yields and reshaped food systems. Urban landscapes changed under the influence of Rockefeller-backed development. The family had succeeded in transforming wealth into permanence, but permanence invites scrutiny. Critics began asking deeper questions, not about legality as in the antitrust era, but about legitimacy. When a private family directs billions into public causes, who sets the priorities? When foundations determine which diseases receive funding, which universities expand, which cultural movements gain prominence, what role remains for democratic choice? Philanthropy at this scale blurs lines. It is neither fully private nor fully public. The Rockefeller model pioneered what some scholars call scientific philanthropy. Decisions were data-driven. Grants required measurable outcomes. Programs were evaluated rigorously. Money was not scattered. It was targeted. This approach created efficiency. It also created influence. For example, when the Rockefeller Foundation funded medical education reform, it reshaped the standards by which doctors were trained. When it supported agricultural research, it influenced food policy in developing nations. When it backed modern art, it helped define cultural legitimacy. These were not small interventions, they were structural. To admirers, this represented responsible stewardship. Wealth, once accumulated, was redirected towards solving systemic problems. The Rockefellers did not simply write checks, they built frameworks. To critics, the story looked different. They argued that fortunes accumulated under monopolistic conditions allowed private families to become shadow policymakers, that philanthropic foundations insulated dynasties from public accountability while preserving influence across generations. Both interpretations contain truth. The Rockefeller story is not a fairy tale of redemption. It is a study in power management. Consider the contrast with earlier Gilded Age families. Many fortunes evaporated within 2 or 3 generations. Extravagance, fragmentation, and lack of structure dissolved wealth. Mansions were sold. Names faded. The Rockefellers avoided that fate by designing governance systems. Trusts established in the early 20th century preserved assets. Family councils coordinated decisions. Professional managers oversaw investments. Philanthropic boards provided collective purpose. The family did not rely on charisma. It relied on architecture, architecture of money, architecture of reputation, architecture of continuity. And that continuity shaped American life in ways few dynasties ever have. But the moral ledger remains complicated. The same fortune that funded global health originated in aggressive consolidation tactics that eliminated competitors. The same name that supports cultural institutions was once synonymous with monopoly. Can philanthropy balance that ledger? Some argue yes, that outcomes matter more than origins, that preventing disease and advancing education outweigh the ruthlessness of 19th century capitalism. Others argue no, that systemic harm cannot be erased by later generosity, that wealth derived from exploitative structures carries permanent ethical residue. Perhaps the more honest conclusion lies between extremes. The Rockefeller legacy demonstrates that power can evolve. It also demonstrates that power rarely disappears. Instead, it changes form. Oil refineries become foundations. Railroad rebates become research grants. Trust agreements become university endowments. The engine continues, only its output shifts. Standing at Kykuit today, overlooking the Hudson River, visitors see more than gardens and sculptures. They see a case study, a fortune built in chaos, consolidated into monopoly, challenged by law, scarred by violence, redirected into institutions, preserved across generations. The house does not answer whether redemption is complete. It simply endures, and endurance itself is a form of victory. In the next chapter, we return to the present, walking through the estate as it exists today, examining what remains visible and what lingers beneath the surface. The road to Kykuit curves upward slowly. Visitors no longer arrive in private carriages or chauffeured sedans. They board shuttle buses from nearby Sleepy Hollow, guided through forests that once formed the outer boundary of a private kingdom. Stone walls line the road, laid by workers more than a century ago. Mature trees arch overhead. The Hudson River glints occasionally between branches, a reminder that this estate was chosen not merely for privacy, but for perspective. When the bus stops, there is no overwhelming facade, no marble staircase designed to intimidate. The house appears solid, dignified, restrained. 40 rooms, fieldstone and limestone, a balance of symmetry and landscape. Kykuit is no longer a private residence. Since the mid-1990s, the estate has opened seasonally to the public under the stewardship of preservation organisations and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. This too is part of the transformation. What was once insulated wealth is now curated history. Visitors enter rooms arranged as they were across generations. Senior's bedroom remains modest. Junior's collections fill cabinets with Chinese porcelain. Nelson's editions of modern art appear in galleries below. The basement corridors, once service passages, now display Picasso tapestries and 20th century masterpieces. The effect is startling. Beneath the classical surface lies abstraction and experimentation. Outside, sculpture punctuates the gardens. A Henry Moore form anchors a terrace. A Calder piece stands against open sky. Steel arcs and bronze figures interrupt the geometry of hedges and fountains. The tension remains visible. Tradition and modernity share space. Wealth and public access coexist. Tour guides recount the family narrative. Oil empire, antitrust battle, philanthropy, politics, conservation. The story unfolds as continuity rather than contradiction. But attentive visitors sense layers. They see the grandeur, but also the discipline. They hear about generosity, but also recall monopoly. They admire preservation, yet understand the fortune's origins in industrial consolidation. Kykuit today functions as museum, archive, and symbol. It is also landscape. Beyond the formal gardens lie acres of preserved forest and parkland. Portions of the original estate were donated for public trails and conservation. The Rockefeller State Park Preserve offers miles of walking paths used by joggers, families, even former presidents who lived nearby. The house that once shielded a dynasty now overlooks public land. The contrast is subtle, but powerful. Inside the nearby Union Church of Pocantico Hills, modern stained glass windows by Henri Matisse and Marc Chagall illuminate a small sanctuary funded by Rockefeller money. Art once considered radical now glows quietly above pews. The family's imprint extends beyond the estate. Foundations continue to operate globally. The Rockefeller name appears on university buildings, research grants, policy initiatives. But it no longer dominates headlines. The oil companies that descended from Standard Oil operate under different names: ExxonMobil, Chevron, others. They are global giants in their own right, separate corporations shaped by new regulations and markets. The dynasty has diffused. More than 200 Rockefeller descendants exist today. Wealth is distributed among trusts and foundations. No single figure commands the authority that John D. Rockefeller once wielded. And yet the house remains. Visitors photograph terraces. They walk through sculpture gardens. They read plaques describing philanthropic milestones. Few leave thinking only about oil. That may be the final transformation. Kykuit is not presented as a monument to monopoly. It is presented as a monument to continuity. Continuity is rare in American industrial history. Fortunes rise and collapse. Names dominate and fade. Buildings decay. Institutions shift. But on this hill overlooking the Hudson, the architecture endures. The estate does not deny its past. It reframes it, and reframing is powerful. In the final chapter, we step back from gardens and galleries to ask the question that lingers over the entire story. What does the Rockefeller saga ultimately reveal about American capitalism itself? At the center of the Rockefeller story lies a paradox. A man builds a monopoly so vast that the government dismantles it. The dismantling makes him richer. His son's company is linked to a massacre that shocks the nation. The family becomes one of the greatest philanthropic forces in history. A dynasty born in ruthless consolidation becomes associated with universities, vaccines, museums, and national parks. How do we reconcile these contradictions? Perhaps we begin by accepting that power does not disappear. It transforms. John D. Rockefeller understood systems. He recognized that chaos creates opportunity for whoever can impose order. The oil boom was disorder. Standard Oil was order. The courts declared that order excessive, but the infrastructure remained. The oil flowed. The companies survived in new forms. The wealth, diversified and invested, expanded further. When Junior faced the moral collapse of Ludlow, he did not dismantle the fortune. He redirected it. He built foundations that functioned like the refineries of his father's era. processing resources into influence. But this time, the output was public health, education, conservation. The third generation layered culture and politics onto that foundation. Each generation adjusted the architecture without demolishing the base. That may be the true lesson. Wealth accumulated at scale becomes architecture. It outlives individuals. It adapts to law. It reshapes reputation. It integrates itself into institutions so deeply that removing it would require dismantling parts of society itself. The Rockefeller legacy reveals something essential about American capitalism. It is not static. It is evolutionary. In the 19th century, power meant controlling rail lines and refining capacity. In the 20th century, it meant funding research and shaping policy. In the 21st, it may mean steering conversations about climate, global development, and sustainability. The tools change. The principle remains. Control the system. Influence the future. Critics will always question whether philanthropy redeems monopoly. Supporters will always point to measurable benefits. Diseases reduced, universities strengthened, parks preserved. Both views coexist. What cannot be denied is durability. More than a century after Standard Oil's breakup, the Rockefeller name remains visible, not as a corporate brand dominating markets, but as a foundation imprinting policy, education, and culture. That endurance was not accidental. It was engineered. Trust preserved capital. Foundations structured giving. Governance models maintained unity. While other Gilded Age fortunes fractured, the Rockefellers institutionalized continuity. Kykuit embodies this continuity. From its terraces, one sees the Hudson flowing steadily south. The river does not rush violently, it moves with persistence. The estate stands as both monument and metaphor. It reminds visitors that wealth can construct more than buildings, it can construct narratives. Narratives of redemption, narratives of responsibility, narratives that soften origins without erasing them. And perhaps that is the final insight. The Rockefeller story is not simply about oil or philanthropy. It is about narrative control. The founder mastered markets. The son mastered reputation. The grandson mastered cultural presence. Together, they mastered time. Whether that mastery represents moral evolution or strategic preservation depends on perspective. But from the lookout, high above the river, it becomes clear that American capitalism does not produce simple heroes or villains. It produces systems. And the most enduring systems are those that learn to adapt. The Rockefeller dynasty adapted. The oil became institutions. The monopoly became foundations. The octopus became a garden. And the house on the hill remains, quiet, measured, enduring, watching the river flow past a nation still wrestling with the same question it asked in 1911. How much power is too much, and who decides?